Welcome to the Parenting Through Grief Education Seminar. My name is Sonia McMahon-Comartin, Bereavement Educator at Canadian Mental Health Association, Windsor-Essex. Thank you for joining today, whether you're joining for the purpose of assisting a child or children on a personal basis, and you've also been impacted by loss perhaps, and or on a professional level. I hope that the strategies offered will be beneficial to you in order to feel more comfortable and confident in supporting young people. So our learning objectives for today are defining what grief is, how children's grief differs from that of adults, talking about common indicators of grief in children, which include physical, behavioral, emotional, academic, social, and spiritual responses. Furthermore, we'll talk about helpful strategies for both you and the child, and when it's time to get help. We do know that children are most influenced by the people that they live with, so the purpose of this session is to assist you in knowing what to say or do, and strategies that will be offered to help you to most effectively support the child or children that are in your life. So first of all, defining grief. And we know that grief is the intense emotional reaction to death. And grief specifically is the internal meaning associated with death that consists of our feelings, thoughts, and images. So in other words, it's how we feel inside in response to a loss. Whereas mourning is different. We do tend to use the words grief and mourning synonymously, in other words, to mean the same thing, but they're actually different because, as I said, grief is how we feel inside and mourning is our outward expression. In other words, it's grief gone public. It's working through our grief in such a way that we're expressing ourselves outwardly through things like talking, crying, writing, and we must mourn in order to heal. That is essential because we need to express ourselves in order to gain enhanced perspective, in order to have some of that weight taken off our shoulders. Not that it can get better, but it's helpful to have that outward expression. You may think of it, and we use this example as well with kids, and you might certainly consider explaining it this way also. It's like having a balloon in your belly. And when we push it down or suppress it, it just continues to get larger. And we're afraid, and it could possibly burst. However, when we vent that balloon and allow some air out, that's very helpful. And as I said, that heavy weight that is on our shoulders doesn't just go away, but it gets a little bit lighter. And each time we talk and cry and write, do all those things to express ourselves, it's furthering and taking another layer, from us and helping us to move forward on our grief journey. At any age, we may have what we call grief attacks, very intense emotional feelings. That's very normal, but allowing ourselves to mourn is what is essential to help us work through our grief. And you'll notice that I'm saying work through our grief. We tend to want to, and even use the terminology, get over our grief, but it's actually not about that. It's very hard work, but when we do that, we know that the pain does soften. Yes, life is different and will be different, but the pain becomes more manageable, and as I just used the terminology, it softens. We know that when we injure ourselves physically, we do allow that and we don't apologize, but we also need to do this with grief. So recognizing the difference once more. Grief is how we feel inside, mourning is our outward expression. At any age or gender, any circumstance, we might tend to be very quiet about our grief. Teenage boys do tend to be more quiet and less expressive, and personality also plays a role in this. But if we can gently encourage and meet children where they're at in their grief, that's so beneficial. Because when we're grieving, we are hurting so much. Our world has been rocked. And if you think about the term bereavement, it means to be torn apart or to have special needs. So thinking about that piece, to be torn apart and to have special needs, things are so different. So realistically, how can we just be okay and expect to go on with life as it was? Okay? So when we're bereaved, knowing that whatever age, whatever the circumstance, support and listening is so hugely beneficial. So, developmental understandings of grief and loss. I'm actually going to switch screens to one that's more in depth that I think will be beneficial for you to look at as well, just because this one is very good also, but the one that I'm going to show you here um, just adds another level, because it also talks about the needs of children at a certain age. It didn't fit well on the PowerPoint, but I hope and trust, there we go, that's a little bit bigger, that you can see that well in order to follow along. So, developmentally, young children, so from the age of 0 to 2, we know that they can sense something's different, that the caregiver is no longer present, but they do not yet understand what death is. And they probably won't remember the person who died. Some common behaviors that are seen with these very young children are fussiness and crying, very clingy to adults, and that need to be held more than normal, because they very likely will have separation anxiety. There may be regressive behavior rather than moving forward with developmental milestones as normal, and very likely sleep and stomach problems also. So needs at this age, it's critical to provide that nonverbal care with hugs and rocking, ensuring that there's lots of that, as well as a stable routine. Now the ages 3 to 5, kids see death as temporary, and you might think of it as magical thinking. It leads them to believe possibly that they somehow caused the loss or somehow can bring the person back. You might think of it like when they're playing and say their feet are hanging out behind a closet door, yet they think they can't be seen, right? It's just very confusing for them. Afterlife beliefs are as well. They may think of heaven like the mall. You know, why can't we just go? And it's understand why a person can't come back. Because of this difficulty in understanding, it may very likely be a concept that needs to continue to be repeated and explained. So kids do need very factual, honest, concrete information because of them seeing death as temporary and believing the person will return. They don't tend to fear death, but they fear the separation. They feel very sad, but often the periods of sadness and grief are also, the word here we have is interspersed, but it's basically that, you know, they play for a while and then they feel sad and ask questions, and then they'll play for a while again and things seem normal, and then, you know, come back and perhaps express some sadness and further questions. That's very normal with children at this age. Developmentally, that is how they process grief. There may be a substitute attachment from the deceased person to another person, so they could become, you know, very attached, maybe clingy to someone else that they formerly weren't, whether it's the other parent or a grandparent or another significant person in their life. They may not remember the person who died. That could go either way. I mentioned the piece about magical thinking and repeatedly asking questions about the loss. So there tends in this age to be regression in behavior as well, for example, bedwetting, toileting, as well as thumb sucking. Some of these things that they may not have had problems with before, they, might very often now because of the impact of the loss on them. Fear of separation, perhaps nightmares, being aggressive. They may be non-compliant, in other words, not listen very well. And another characteristic could be that they're confused and they just have concerns and uncertainty about their own well-being and safety. So what can we provide for children to help at this age? Best things, again, a stable daily routine. We know for any children, structure is beneficial, but very key after death loss. Honesty and using the words dead and died. As a society, we tend not to be always comfortable and really good at using those words, but it's helpful for kids to learn that accurate, correct terminology. We never want to tell a child, for example, that, someone is sleeping. That creates fear that they will not wake up potentially. So let's be simple and honest in our communication and answering of questions, providing love, reassurance, and all of us at any age need to be heard. So it's critical to listen to our children. So whoops, I'm not going to the right spot here. Sorry about that. All right, so now looking at the ages of about 6 to 10, if loss is due to death, they might also begin to think that they're going to die. They'll perhaps start asking questions, reasons why the person died, and may fear both that others in their life and themselves will die. At this age, they do have more comprehension of the permanence and inevitability of death, that it will happen to all of us, and they'll develop interest in the cause for loss. They may feel guilt and shame and blame themselves for the death, as I said, and also possibly see it as punishment for bad behavior. So that's a difficult one also. Kids in this age bracket often ask questions and experience anger in addition to the fear and sadness. So you might see aggression come out as well. There could be compulsive caregiving and them trying to overcompensate and care for even adults in a way that wasn't previously typical. And grief ebbs and flows, so in this age as well, going up and down in their emotions to a great extent. 1 minute it almost seems like things are normal, and in the next minute, they're asking lots of questions and very sad. And I should mention as well the piece with anger. The reason that anger is so often experienced is because it's the easiest emotion to go to. It's safer than saying, this really hurts me. Anger draws a response, and we know that kids do act out and show their feelings through behavior. So what we always need to recognize and ask is, ask ourselves is what is underneath that anger, because we do know that there's something underneath of that and they're hurting. We also know that emotions are not good or bad. They are what they are, but it's how we express them that is really important. And kids, really may struggle with this, especially at such a young age. There may be possessiveness of the parent who is still living, if it was at the death of a parent. Also regression in behavior and somatic or bodily complaints, that things are hurting to a great extent and that pain continues quite chronic. There very likely will be difficulty in paying attention and concentrating, not completing schoolwork, maybe even having fear of going to school and staying all day, as well as other fears and withdrawing that could be seen as quite exaggerated. So how can we help and support kids in this age bracket? Expressing their feelings is so critical as well, and doing that creatively at any age adds a positive dimension, but certainly at this age, even if, drawing ability or, printing and spelling is not very developed, for them to be creative with art and writing, any type of painting, music, whatever it might be, that is very helpful. Giving concrete answers to questions, validating feelings, providing that love and support and reassurance, especially in the area that they're not to blame. And again, a common theme, to be heard, so listen, as we need to do at every age. 10 to 12-year-old bracket, they tend to have a realistic view of death and its permanence. Sorry, I'm trying to get that up higher and it's skipping on me. Okay, I'll just leave it there. A realistic view of death and its permanence. So, they're recognizing that, someone has died and they're not coming back. There will very likely be specific questions about death and the body and what happens to the body asked, and interested in some of those more difficult, what we'll call gory details that we tend to not always want to think about, but they're trying to understand, so they ask those questions. Also concerned with the practical realities of life. Who will take care of me and how will this loss impact my family? Also identifying strongly with the deceased and really, feeling that emotional pain and recognizing the difference in their life now that that person is no longer physically present. They'll be upset by the disruption, perhaps blame others. There may be some separation anxiety and denial and or guilt of what's happening. Difficulty concentrating, again, is very common, and as a result, a decline in school performance because of the difficulty concentrating. Perhaps as well, lack of interest might occur. And at this age, kids would like to be able to fix things. They want to make it better. So what can we do for them? Helpful to give permission to be where they're at with their grief and provide outlets, allow them to feel that anger and sadness, to feel moments of relief when they're able as well, and just really, validate, recognize, help them to recognize how much you understand and yes, you appreciate and know that they are feeling very sad and this isn't fair, and asking those questions, why that this needed to happen will also be something common that kids will do. And we also need to offer support and assistance and to know who can help them to be heard. So, to listen closely as much as we're able, as well as provide suggestions of other supports, and then ensuring that those connections are made right for school and other involvements that they're in, that people understand and recognize and appreciate the difficulty that they're going through. So characteristics in the 13 to 18-year-old range: the recognition that life is fragile, that death does happen to all of us, and we cannot, come back to life once we have died. They may very well worry about their own mortality, right? That they will die. And they may go in the direction of trying not to think or talk about the death rather than actually communicating about it. It might be more of that avoidance and hiding feelings, and not wanting to look different from their peers, just kind of going day to day. And we do see, some people who have had death occur at this age come back later for support because they recognize that they haven't dealt with it. They may ponder and ask questions, regarding religious and philosophical beliefs. There's often anger at one, the person who died, but also the people that were involved in the death. For example, why couldn't the doctors or nurses, save my loved one? Um, they should have engaged in this medical procedure and they didn't. So, they recognize that and often express that anger, or at least have that anger inside, which we hope will come out through the work that we want to do with them. Maybe fears for the future. There's, for the most part, adult views of loss with teenagers, and they may start to show concern for the future for themselves, as well as the impact on many people that were impacted by this death. So behaviors that result commonly, anger and aggression, lots of moodiness and ups and downs that are very unpredictable, even to a greater extent than what is normal with teenagers. Tough time focusing, feeling possessive of things and people that they do have in their life as something to hold on to and something they have control over. Complaints within their body of aches and pains. Maybe some phobias develop, or extensive fears that they didn't have in the past. Withdrawing from parents and wanting to spend lots of time with friends, probably as an escape and not wanting to think about it or deal with it. Perhaps pushing limits or rules and engaging in further risk taking, as well as doing things to make them feel better in the moment. We know that long term, being promiscuous, using drugs and alcohol doesn't assist, or certainly doesn't minimize what someone's going through, but because in the moment of engaging in that behavior it does, they might go in that direction. There could be more increased defiance and delinquent acts, as well as suicidal ideation. So, with all of this being said, again, a trusted adult or peer for support, having that small, safe circle is vital. Parental openness and sharing feelings rather than minimizing them, or, trying to fix them. So we want to be open, and no matter what our age and no matter what circumstance, we always want to join someone where they're at. I think back to one of my early mentors who used the phrase, be there, be sensitive, and be silent. So in other words, be present, be sensitive to what someone's feeling and not try to take that away. And when I say be silent, we don't mean that, always, of course. We want some response and affirmation and validation of what someone is feeling, but we tend to talk more than listen and go back to our own experiences rather than being fully present and listening. Again, it's not about fixing, it's joining someone where they're at so they can be on this journey and ultimately come to, their own reconciliation with the death. Hard to do because it's hard, of course, very, very difficult for us as adults to lose, but then when we're in relationship and or working, with a child professionally who has experienced loss, very painful also for us to see them go through that. So we tend to want to fix it, but it's about us walking beside them and joining them on that journey and allowing them to be expressive and work through this pain. And that being said, we're doing that. We're helping them to learn to manage feelings, providing continued emotional support, even if it feels like we've, said certain things. Repetition, even at this age, may be necessary for us, or even in what they need to ask and what they need to process. Being very present as parents and other key caregivers and role models, and encourage their efforts towards independence. That's another very helpful piece as well. So I hope developmentally this chart has been beneficial for you to see. This chart actually can be found at the website good-grief.org, and it's called Grief and Developmental Stages. So if you'd like to refer to that, again, Grief and Developmental Stages on good-grief.org. So I'll just go back to the presentation, the PowerPoint here. And next we will talk about how grief impacts us in the various realms. As I said at the beginning, it's not just emotional as we may think, but there are the 5 realms that we'll talk about. And just to note as well that kids actually tend to be what I might call better at grief because they have less concept of permanence, where, as I mentioned earlier, they go from playing to being sad to playing again, then being sad, whereas adults, we have more of a tendency to get stuck, and it's difficult for us not to feel guilty and hard for us to find joy. So there's also things that we can learn from grieving children. And as adults, since we don't have the play piece like kids do, we can only engage in activities of living which we tend to want to avoid. So again, be mindful of that, and it's interesting to see what perspective and insights we may even learn from children. So firstly, some common physical responses. Some of this you'll notice was stated in the developmental phase, so I'll go quickly over certain points. I mentioned the stomach aches, headaches, physical aches, low energy and weakness. There could be increased accidents, injuries, and illness, just with that, vulnerability of what is going on, and just, being less aware, perhaps just more accident prone as well. Sleep disturbances too, very common at any age for us to go to bed. Our mind thinks about things, and going to sleep can just be a struggle. We often use that phrase, the wheels keep on turning and they won't stop. And that happens though, especially when the grief has been avoided all day and they're what I call our balloon, right? I said, use the analogy of the balloon in the belly is full. So if we can continue to encourage children to talk about grief and express themselves, no matter if that's sadness, anger, frustration, whatever that comes out in, we need to do that, and we will sleep better. Brain exercises and mindfulness exercises and meditation is not only helpful for adults, but kids too. There are some mindfulness apps that you may want to look into. Most common ones that I'm aware of are called Headspace, Calm, and Breathe. Headspace, Calm, and Breathe. Maybe take a look at those apps. There will be information on websites as well, but these apps people find helpful to utilize. There's some free points on them. If you go further than that, then they do cost, but they can be helpful just to bring that relaxation piece and focus on something different. And you may also encourage children to use brain exercises. For example, think of objects that are the color pink, for example, then objects that are the color blue, and go from there. Or think of all the words that start with the letter A, B, C, and continue on from there. And often early in the alphabet, they'll tend to go to sleep. So depending on the age and what works for the child, but just recognizing that there are some things like that can be used, because we know how often our sleep is impacted with grief. It's not uncommon for our appetites to be impacted too, whether that's loss of appetite or increased eating. So being mindful of that for children, allowing them to eat often, having fruits and cut up veggies accessible, other snacks and meals that are high in protein if there's not a nut allergy. Um, 8 almonds a day and about 4 walnuts, that's really good. Peanut butter, yogurts, cheese, milk, all those that are very high in protein as well to give energy. New habits or regression in behavior. I mentioned that as well in the developmental chart. We might recognize and think about grief like a naughty toddler. The more we try to ignore it, the more it persists and gets louder. It needs to be addressed. So I would say this is grief's way of saying, pay attention to me. So when there are issues with toileting, getting dressed, etc., helping the child, work through that, encouraging them though, rather than being critical and angry. It's a tough balance because we find that many parents struggle with trying to balance the parenting and grief needs. So being supportive to children, but also, having reasonable expectations of what they try to do for themselves, as well as their behavior, right? We do need to remind kids that, it's not okay to harm themselves or others, hitting, destroying things at home or at school isn't okay. So providing those explanations, having that conversation, and helping them find suitable outlets that are beneficial. For example, for any of us to, hit a pillow or a mattress or punching bag, that's a very beneficial physical outlet rather than hurting our hand or arm on a wall and also doing damage, to whatever area we're in. So finding beneficial outlets that are workable both for the safety aspect as well as to, allow those feelings outside of us, which I said earlier is so important. The increased psychosomatic complaints, so that pain and tension that perhaps wasn't there so much, but that could be very much a part of what they're experiencing. At times it's exaggerated because of the confusion and just uncertainty how they're going to get through this, but being present and supportive, and knowing as well that when kids go through this and they have that fear also of separation anxiety, we need to provide safe measures and try to have that balance between, them being able to depend on us, but also, again, age dependent, but, that freedom. We still want them after a little bit of time has gone by to go back to school, or in today's scenario, it would have been the last few months still doing schoolwork, right? Rather than just avoiding everything. And when there is that insecurity and separation anxiety, having things put into place with texting or phone calls, to check in periodically, not every 5 minutes, but, say at lunchtime, be in connection. We also know that teenagers tend to check in on parents often, even if they're not obvious about it, just because they're, so uncertain and struggling, and especially if one of the parents have died, they're trying to often fill that void and that role that the other parent had previously been in. So let's look at now behavioral responses. There may be really disruptive and aggressive behaviors. Kids might just be so out of sorts and not listen and do things that they shouldn't, including risk-taking. Might be just, hyperactive and high energy in their behavior. On the other hand, some kids really withdraw and go backwards. When there is lying. Of course, that needs to be discussed and addressed with them and explained that that is not beneficial for anyone. Um, when there is that separation anxiety, I just mentioned putting safety measures in place that's workable. And when there's refusal to return to school or daycare, explaining the benefits of going back and being connected. And normally there is previous connection with, the teacher or um, daycare supervisor in order to have them assist with a smoother transition back, and for us to have our children realize the positive connections that their friends will make, as well as them still having fun and being able to laugh. And routine for any of us and meaning and purpose is beneficial. So that's another reason why going back to that normalcy of learning and being in the presence of others, even if the focus is difficult, is very important. We've mentioned the rage and anger, the high need for attention. So trying to balance that out, giving them attention, but not having such high levels of dependency that end up being very maladaptive behavior that will be difficult to get out of. So, discussing, I recognize that you want to be, connected, or I recognize that, you know, there's more need for us to talk, but when it's about negative attention, not allowing that and excusing that just because of the grief. And I mentioned that piece about checking in on other loved ones as well. So, bottom line, kids really benefit from routine and consistency. We know that's part of basic parenting under normal circumstances. So when it's further impacted by grief, to really have that compassion, yet recognizing that it's not about staying up late all the time for comfort or just getting away with things that will cause further problems and complexities. We all benefit from consistency and predictability. And if you think about it this way, what if the speed limit signs were removed from roads, right? That creates confusion and uncertainty for us. So we can appreciate if rules and day-to-day normal tasks and structure was removed, how that adversely impacts our kids. So if we expect that children should still have their normal chores and expectations and behavior, even though they very likely will resist, think about that in terms of not only the short term but the longer term benefits for the family, as well as the school, family, and anything else they're involved in. Common emotional responses: that insecurity that naturally comes, concern with being treated differently, often very helpful to connect with friends prior to going back to school, and friends who are very compassionate and supportive and will understand. There may be that I don't care attitude, and what's the point, and life's not worth it. So to do some work on that and help them see in perspective, not minimize the impact of the loss, but see all who and what they still do have and what there is to care about, and finding ways to keep their loved one's memory alive, even though they're not physically present. Depression may be experienced. We know that it commonly occurs when things are out of balance. So acknowledging that, working through that, helping to see what can be somewhat normal and stable in spite of, the large piece that can no longer be. Kids might be overly sensitive, frequently tearful, and we understand that because with grief, right, all of us can tend to be very sensitive and cry very easily. And we, as I said earlier, don't want to think of that as a negative piece because that emotion is important. And if it's coming at times that seem to be embarrassing for kids, or it just seems to be so much, that further dialogue, writing, self-expression, if there's a lot of anger and tears that need to come out, perhaps writing a letter to their loved one, ripping up paper to shreds and just saying, I wish my life wasn't like this, and how I so wish this wouldn't have happened. Those type of exercises that allow the tears out and usually make for more intense emotion cause there to be less of the overly sensitive and tearfulness in times when it isn't as easy to express, for example, in school and social settings. Mood swings, very common, trouble concentrating, irritability. Some kids may appear unaffected by the loss, just trying to go about their day-to-day as they try to figure things out, or maybe, the embarrassment and just not wanting to face the reality. Suicidal thoughts or ideation, increase in fears. It may be guilt, confusion, regret, and anger that occurs also. All of us need to express our regrets because if we hold them, they'll turn to shame. And in any relationship, we have regrets and guilt because we're human, and we do need to work through these. We need to, cry in the shower, maybe go somewhere where we cannot be heard and just express ourselves. And know also that in our humanness, right, there normally are things that we wish we would have said, or especially with unexpected death, maybe things weren't left on as positive note as we would have wanted. But if we go back to the place of those positives and recognizing all that was in the relationship and not just focusing on potentially that last encounter that may have been very difficult. There could be tendency to withdraw or spend a great deal of time alone. So allowing space is important, but also maintaining a connection. And that may be doing things like playing cards, puzzles, going on bike rides. We know that normally many kids talk more openly in the car, right, when they're not needing to have eye contact. So recognizing what is most beneficial for your child and when they will tend to more openly share. Could also be nightmares, and that usually means as well that the balloon's full and they need to take care of something and there needs to be feelings expressed. Some children do have scary dreams about their deceased loved one coming to get them, so allowing them again to be very expressive about that to help lessen that tendency of those types of dreams and nightmares. I mentioned earlier that lack of focus is a very difficult piece when we're grieving, and as adults too. So not having as high of expectations for kids, with their schoolwork, and teachers perhaps, giving less schoolwork as well. We do know that there's a reason for decline in grades also. And just to give a little bit of an explanation about that, the amygdala, so that's the part of the brain that fires off chemicals of emotions, and it's firing all the time when we're grieving. And the frontal lobe thinking is also impacted. So we need to understand that our brains are working differently in grief. So that has a huge impact, and no wonder that things are different. So when there's, incomplete work or poor quality, increase in absences because kids may feel they just can't do it. So again, trying to balance that out and be with them in their struggles, encouraging them to do well, but being patient and having less work. On the other end of that spectrum, there may be the tendency to be an overachiever and trying to be perfect, trying to overcompensate for some of what is no longer in their life. So that's another piece that needs to be recognized what could happen. Might also be inattentiveness, daydreaming, increase in behavior problems, lack of interest, and school avoidant. So let's just kind of summarize this in the way of, imagine if you took someone out in the middle of the ocean and threw them overboard. Think about what's the best way that they could survive. So that would be to float, right? Think about if someone took you out into the ocean and threw you overboard. What would you do? Even if you're a good swimmer, right? We tire, and there's so many factors that could be working against us with wind and waves and current and undertows, things like that we could drown. So if we can just float, it's terrifying, very difficult to let ourselves be in grief, but if we can just be with that. Grief does and it will overcome us and feel like it's pulling us under, just like those waves, but it won't last forever. It'll soften, but we always need to remember there's no quick way through it. So it's important to recognize the intensity of grief waves. It'll continue to keep coming. However, with this work, it does become less sad and overwhelming and all-consuming. Okay? So thinking firstly of that need to just be with our grief, that need to float, and allowing our kids to do the same. So some common social responses. There may be tendency to withdraw from friends, activities and sports, use drugs and or alcohol. There might just be changes in relationships with peers. Some former friends may not get it, or there could be, embarrassment, or maybe that person talks about a loss they had and, I just got over it. And that sense of lack of understanding may change things. And there could be someone who has had a loss and really gets it, so the child gravitates towards them. Change in family roles, and again, especially if it was due to parental death. There may be stealing or shoplifting tendencies, again, that, quick fix, trying to fill a void, difficult being in social situations where they were once comfortable, as well as wanting to be physically close to safe adults to try to, have some sense of all rightness in this world that feels that it's been rocked in a major way. So we've talked about the routine and consistency being important for adults too. It's difficult for any of us who are bereaved to just have that get up and go and do things. Sometimes a grief break is needed though, and we need to give ourselves permission to stay home for a day, trying to find what the healthy balance is, not avoiding all activities and social invitations, but not needing to accept all of them, and recognizing that maybe there is a lengthy event that the bereaved person is invited to, but having the child or teenager maybe attend for 2 hours instead of 5 or 6 hours will be beneficial. We know certainly that all of our activities have been different the last few months, but now that we're able to do a bit more socially again, recognize what is beneficial, what that looks like. And if the death that you're dealing with, if there wasn't able to be a funeral or memorial, perhaps there will be soon, but also recognize that, there could be added dynamics and questions and feelings of not being at all okay, because that couldn't even be normal right now. having the planning occur over time, even if a funeral, memorial service, celebration of life hasn't occurred yet, is positive. And having young people be involved in that gives ultimately whatever service that will be had great meaning, as well as that's very meaningful and important for the child, just to be able to give a little bit of input or maybe a little bit of responsibility around that. When I mentioned earlier about drugs and alcohol, changing how we think and feel, that only works for the moment, as we know. We know that's only a temporary uplifting feeling. Alcohol is actually a depressant. We also know that some teenagers, in particular teenage boys, use alcohol because it's the only way that they will express their emotions. But no matter what the case, it's very helpful to identify who the safe people are that our children can talk to. And some kids do say hurtful things about death. They may learn circumstances of the death from other people talking in their own family. And some people don't understand grief and try to avoid it. So again, that simple, honest conversation with our kids so they learn and are aware of what they need to be from ourselves and the family, rather than, learning details from someone else at school. That's really important to be mindful of. And now let's move to common spiritual responses. It can go anywhere from anger at God or whomever their higher power is to really finding maybe strength and such further value in whatever their beliefs are. So there's a broad spectrum of that. The questions of why me and why now, we know that there are not always answers to them, but for anyone's grief journey to be with those questions and just have that as part of their process is normally very beneficial. And like I said, even though there aren't necessarily answers, it's a helpful piece to just be with. There may be questions of their meaning of life, confusion about what happens after death, which really none of us here on earth knows for sure. Some people have, very clear beliefs. Others really doubt that and are uncertain. But allowing kids the space to explore their beliefs and expressing what they believe and processing that. Kids don't understand the abstractness of heaven and beyond. And it's about our beliefs, both personal and abstract. If we encourage our children to, be open to what they are, no matter what they decide to take on as their beliefs, that's very helpful. As I said, doubting or questioning previous beliefs, maybe having a sense of despair about the future is what it is too, and changing in their values and questioning what's important. So not just putting a lid on that, but allowing the child or teen to, work through these questions, especially with the guidance of someone trusted. There are ways that we all choose to remember and believe. And it's not about right or wrong, but it's about what works for people, right? Some people feel that their loved one is in everything beautiful, for example, such as butterflies, cardinals, leaves. For others, that doesn't have the same meaning, but it's taking hold of what is beneficial for you and finding strength in that. And it's also helpful to teach about beliefs and ensure to outline the difference between spirituality and what spirits are versus things that might be fearful, such as ghosts. Okay? So keeping that in mind, that, with grief, there's so much, that's abstract and uncertain. But if we can encourage our children to be introspective. In other words, think about it inside as well as discuss it outwardly, to help establish their belief system, which also can change over time, but again, to grab hold of what gives them strength. I hope that this is clear. One hard part of this as a webinar that's not interactive, you don't have the opportunity to ask questions on the spot. Certainly there will be more explanation here, and I hope that is helpful. You can always contact us at CMHA if there are uncertainties as well. And these webinars are live approximately once a month, for sure once every 2 months. If you ever want to sit in on one, just register through the CMHA Windsor-Essex website in order to have that interaction as well with myself and other participants. So important things to remember. Our children do feel the pain of loss, but they don't have the same coping skills established that we as adults have already developed. They grieve in bursts because they cannot normally tolerate long periods of being sad. They often express their feelings of grief through behavior, and that can make things complicated and difficult. For some, it can be, more positive because they are able to, see it in the light of that they're still connected with the person and they're gone physically, but they still can do very important and special things to remember. But again, that comes normally with maturity, and that's why there's so often the work that we need to do to help kids get to that place. Grief may not show on the outside. Kids may hide their sadness and deny the reality and seem unaffected. So we need to be very aware of that. They're not just shoving down their feelings, in other words, suppressing them. Kids may be delayed grievers. They may appear unaffected for a while and then fall apart. So please don't be surprised if that happens as well, that they seem okay and then it just, they can't do it anymore, right? It just is like filling up a container, but then it becomes full and overflows. Each child's grief experience, just like all of ours, is unique. Factors that affect the grief response of children: gender may, just in how we deal with things. Larger than that might be just an individual's, personality and sensitivity to emotion. Our age, so where we're at emotionally and developmentally, religious and ethnic customs. So as I said earlier, there could be, some strength that we have as a result of our belief system. Relationship with the person that died or was involved with the loss. Most certainly, there's a huge impact to our grief because when there was a very close relationship, right, the grief is more intense. Prior grief experiences to have an idea what to expect, the circumstances of the loss. We know that expected death is also, something that's not simple to go through, but it does offer that time of anticipatory grief where we can adjust to the reality, where we can, express our emotions. Whereas with sudden death, when there was no time for goodbye or preparation, it's just a different dynamic. And when I mentioned the term anticipatory grief, that is something that basically means as we anticipate the loss, we're doing some of our grief work prior to the death. When there's support available, makes a world of difference. We always want beneficial support of someone who really understands. When there's unfinished business, can make it really tough too. The physical and mental health of someone, if someone is, physically unwell or mentally unwell, that can definitely complicate the grief response and add, that there must be more hard work that needs to be done to that. Our personal resilience, in other words, our ability to experience situations and, as we say, maybe bounce back from them, that also is a factor that impacts our grief response at any age, and children as well. So when a child is resilient and can see things, in perspective, and recognize that even though this happened, not everything is negative in the world, that's beneficial to them, as well as our ability overall to cope with stress. So, some words and actions to avoid, just to give you some guidance. We're typically well meaning, but at times we do say things that we feel are helpful, but they're actually not. So, we don't want to suggest that the child has grieved long enough or should get over it. Never want to act as if nothing happened. We also don't want to tell a child things they'll later need to unlearn. I gave the example earlier of, you know, um, grandma is sleeping. Um, we don't want to use that kind of language because it causes confusion and fear, as well as we don't want to lie about the death circumstance. For example, when someone dies by suicide, um, depending on the developmental level, there may not be readiness to specifically tell the child that, but we don't want to say they had a heart attack. The child may ask how someone died, and it might be, that grandpa got hit by a train. And that would be the truth. And then developmentally, as they ask further questions and are ready, to let them know that unfortunately grandpa, was very unwell and he couldn't see the point of living anymore, so he stepped out in front of the train. Okay, so do you see that initially at the younger age, we still tell the truth, but just give the amount of information they're ready for at the time. Do not force them to engage in mourning activities like attending the cemetery or looking at pictures if they refuse. Hopefully at some point there will be that readiness, but we don't want to force that and make that a negative experience. Don't deny the opportunity to engage in activities which are meaningful for them. Some kids, may see the benefit in doing things that we as adults do as well, like talking to pictures, kissing pictures. Maybe there's an activity that they want to do with friends that you don't feel they're ready for, but they actually are, and they would find it very beneficial and meaningful. Don't rely on your child for your own emotional support. What that means is that kids can be somewhat supportive to parents and, offer hugs, etc., but our child should not be our therapist. They should not be our main person to go to for support, right? Ensure that you as an adult have people available to you, whether that be friends and family members and or a therapist, but that it's not your child who you're putting all of your grief and feelings on to. We also don't want to burden children with adult responsibilities. Yes, have them take care of chores that they were previously responsible for, but this typically occurs when one of the parent has died. The surviving parent feels so overwhelmed and gives the child excessive responsibilities. So we need to be mindful of that, and perhaps it's about reaching out to family members to assist with that, hire certain jobs to be done, etc. We also don't want to protect our children from our sad feelings. As much as we can't dump everything on them, and that's not healthy to do, modeling them seeing us express our emotions and us crying is actually very positive and helps give them permission to know that that is okay. We also don't want to say things like, I know how you feel, you'll be stronger because of this, it could be worse, you still have, if it was a friend who died, for example, other friends in your life. We don't ever know exactly how anyone feels. Maybe they'll come to the place one day that they feel this loss has been an opportunity for their growth, but to put that on someone and have that expectation isn't helpful or healthy. And this idea of it could be worse, that's someone trying to, fix things, and more, when we say that, is usually about ourselves struggling with the pain. But we always want someone when they're grieving to be able to be in that space. They need to go to the depths of the pain. So that's why we don't want to say, it could be worse and you still have whoever else in your life. Let them be with that emotion. Let them experience the pain. Again, it's hard for us to see our kids go through this, but they also need to. Okay, now we're at the point of helpful strategies. So it's definitely better for a child to learn about death from a parent or family member. I guess I alluded to that a little bit early, but take the opportunity to educate children and continue to help in their grief. It's certainly a lifelong process and doesn't go away, but we want to, and it's beneficial to help them understand from a close family member. Answer questions with honesty, provide factual information. It's important to be there to help them cope with the injury, with the hurt that this caused. And when they do ask questions, it means that they're old enough to know the answer. We don't want to ever lie to them. I mentioned using accurate words such as died, dead, and avoiding words like lost, moved on, even passed away. As adults, we tend to still use that. But technically, to be to the point of, the words died, dead, etc., is really what it's about, and accurate explanation. These words tend to be because we're a death-denying society and still working towards accepting death as part of life. I also have said a couple times about sleeping. You can tell that's a real bugaboo of mine because that can do so much damage if we explain it that way. Giving developmentally appropriate definitions of words is also extremely important. And how about you think of it this way? Let's compare talking about death, to talking about sex. It's hard to teach kids about sex. It's not necessarily comfortable, but we need to ask questions and answer questions at their level. We tend to want to protect our kids, but we do need to be truthful. We can't protect them. A person's death is part of their story. We didn't invite it and prefer that it not be this way, but we don't have a choice. And I think you'll really find this analogy beneficial. It's a page in the child's story, but not the title of their book. So we don't want to rip out that page because they'll search for it. If you do not approach it with honesty, the child will find it. They'll look online, they'll maybe find out at school, etc. So I've just got this friend here that isn't wanting to be part of our session here, this bug. Sorry about that interruption. So we need to be honest because, like I said, if we're not, they'll find out from others at school and they may not find the actual, they may not receive the truthful story. And they may even look online for details that we haven't been forthcoming about and find them. And again, that will create complications and potentially anger because of lack of honesty. They'll have a scab if they find out information that isn't true, the scab will be ripped off and they'll revert back to where they were. They'll be furious, actually, if you lie to them. We need to explain all situations, including suicide. One way of doing this is telling kids that their loved one had an illness in their brain, right? Just like we do in our bodies. We know that we can become very unwell in our brain, right? So we need to be open to mental health concerns and unwellness, not only physical. Also need to reassure that death isn't contagious, right? Just because one person died doesn't mean that the rest of us are going to. Also talking about encouraging discussion of that person or pet who died, using their names, talking about memories. keeping them alive, by looking at pictures and remembering stories, writing down special memories for future keepsake. Yes, it may cause tears to flow, but that's actually a huge part of the work and ultimately the healing. Involve kids in decisions about attending the memorial service and activities, as that it's important for kids to attend if at all possible. We don't want to have them not attend. If they're not comfortable attending every part of what is happening, have that discussion, but be very open so they can make an informed decision that we'll be happy with now as well as in the future. And you can do this by preparing them for what will happen, what they'll see, what occurs, and how people tend to behave at memorial activities. Also modeling appropriate responses to loss. So, as I said earlier, that it's natural to cry, to be very sad, to have very empty and difficult feelings, and to really struggle as we're going through this. And we know that our natural defense mechanisms of shock and numbness help us get through those early days of these pieces and decisions that we need to make. And sorry, I think I'm going to have a excuse me, first a bug interrupting us, now my sneeze. Modeling appropriate responses. So for us to be able to talk to our kids about that, as well as be emotional ourselves, is just very, very important and will help kids in the short term and long term. Providing lots of hugs, holding, physical contact, and nurturing. Encouraging, allowing fun and happy times, because as much as this has taken so much from all of us, and we're all very sad when a loss occurs, we know that life does and needs to continue, to be fun, and smiles and laughter be part of it. Asking and discussing what you need to comfort yourself, and creating a list of comfort strategies, things that will help them together with your child. For example, that text at lunchtime, that teddy bear in their backpack, that special stone in their pocket, or that picture or other memento in their pocket. Not something that there would be fear and irreplaceable if lost, but something that is special, yet if it was misplaced, it would be okay. Listen so much and say a little. I think I made that point earlier when I talked about be there, be sensitive, be silent. Listening quietly and attentively. Acknowledging feelings just with words such as, oh, okay, or I see, or Keeping the lines of communication very open. Exploring religious beliefs and providing explanations to kids. And reassuring child that all emotions, no matter what they are, such as sadness, anger, relief, and guilt, those sadness, anger, and guilt ones that we tend to think is negative, are not negative, but they're normal and they just are what they are. Teaching kids about death and the cycle of life from a young age is also really important. Giving feelings a name, that sounds frustrating, or you sound lonely. Oh, it sounds like you're really struggling with that and you're worried. Maybe giving their wishes in fantasy. I wish I could make your dog come home. If I had a magic wand, I would change what's gone on. I recognize that it's really sad for you. I know that you wish your dad was still alive. Be gentle and patient, but also allow for expression of feelings, but not in a way that hurts others or things or the child. I can see how angry you are about this person's death, but tell me with words or draw me a picture. But it's not okay to hit. Okay, so emphasizing what the boundaries are, what is okay, but also what is not appropriate. Engage children in concrete activities to remember the loved one. maybe a tree planting, creating some type of memorial book, watching home movies, making their favorite meal, keeping linking objects, so objects that were special to the loved one, and being creative. There's many people that are using, stones, maybe rocks, painted or not, and bringing them to places that the person traveled or maybe desired to travel and never got there. There are jars that can be purchased, but also to just use a jar with pieces of paper and, encouraging kids, as well as, perhaps doing this as a family activity, to write memories on the pieces of paper, put it in the jar, and then maybe, on a significant date, an anniversary date, which some people like to call angelversary or Memorial Day, etc., open that up. Or it could be a holiday, it might just be a regular day, but point being to share these memories. And maybe when someone writes one, it will be read that same day, as well as kept in the collection for future. There's also great value for children to receive, maybe a teddy bear with clothing on it that was made from their loved one's clothing, or special quilts can be made. People are making aprons out of ties now, or maybe a table runner that is made out of a tie could be used on a dresser or nightstand, for example, in a child's room, if they were comfortable and felt that was special. Being creative to keep loved ones' memories alive and doing things that are very meaningful. Reassure children of love and support, reflect on their unspoken feelings, and share similar experiences that you have had as well. Help children to use their grief in positive ways, like helping friends who have experienced a similar situation, or raising money in their loved ones' names by, engaging in an activity of selling lemonade, or for a while kids were making, rainbow moon bracelets. There could be other types of jewelry or mementos, or with the rock painting that we commonly see now, maybe kids will, engage in that type of activity and sell them to raise funds to be donated in their loved one's name. Provide structure and routine, but give some flexibility at your discretion that's helpful. And reassure kids that they didn't cause the death. And be cautious about false assurance. And by this I mean, we want to reassure our kids that they didn't cause the death. We talk about the person who died, but we can't, when they say, Mommy, promise me that you won't die, or Daddy, promise me that you won't die, we can't just say, I'll never leave you. We hope that that doesn't happen for a long time, but what we say is something like, I drive as safely as possible, wearing my seatbelt and not being on my phone or being under the influence of alcohol or substances. I go about my day as safely as possible. I eat as healthy as I can, that type of thing, to reassure them that you're doing what is within your control to live a long time, but not say, that I won't die until I'm old. Again, we'll hope so, but we don't know that for sure. So in fairness to our kids, we need to express it that way. Include kids in the process of acceptance and healing. And I gave some examples earlier of how, we might do that, and encourage, coloring, drawing, reading, playing, art, music, dance, acting, and or sports. Any or all of those are very effective and can be done in honor of a loved one. Working with the school to tailor the workload, allow for some regressive behavior. I've mentioned these points earlier, right? The school to let the teacher know, and potentially continuous communication for a while will be beneficial. And when I said earlier, not punishing for regressive behavior, but providing understanding and encouragement when that happens. Expect and accept mood swings, as tough as undesirable as that can be. Teach kids how to change their physical response and learning deep breathing techniques, as well as imagery of beautiful scenarios and going through muscle relaxation. We have the benefit of so many books and online resources now that that's really helpful for us and for our children. Recognize and praise kids when they're using positive comfort strategies, encouraging books, and I've got a website at the end of this presentation where there's you can find a large list of resources, and they also give a suggested age range. Be proactive and inform kids about changes in routine and expectations. Be consistent and predictable whenever it's possible. Try to ensure a good amount of sleep, healthy foods and drinks, exercise, and balance of quiet time. Provide or replace items that provide security. So maybe that special blanket, or like I said, teddy bear, or it might be a small memento that they could just feel in their pocket. That is helpful. Plan for anticipated difficult times such as holidays and anniversaries, and it's beneficial for all of us to think about what we'll do on those special days. It doesn't have to be anything significant or expensive, but to know we're going to light this special candle on this day, or it might be a visit to the cemetery, or it might be cooking the loved one's favorite meal for dinner, or it might be taking an album out and looking at older pictures. Plan for these days and know that there may be further emotion that day, but also leading up to that day. That anticipation is often as difficult or even more difficult than the specific holiday or anniversary date itself. So just to conclude, some important things to remember. Grief is a lifelong process that changes as we journey. Grieving children will go between grief bursts and normal participation in activities of living. The grief burst will be surprising, unexpected, and overwhelming reactions that could cause some fear, both to ourselves as adults and children. There is no end date to grief, but we know that grief does get easier. Through my own personal experiences, as well as working with many, many people on this difficult journey, we know that it softens. We don't forget, and it does change our life, but we're better able to integrate loss into our life as we do the work, right? It's not just that time heals, but what we do in that time that's beneficial. And when is it time to get help? So when there's extreme changes in behavior, when the grief interferes with the daily functioning, if the expression of or lack of feeling seems just too strong or for what's happening or lasts too long, if a child exhibits self-destructive behavior, get in trouble with the law, if they're very belligerent, acting out, impulsive, and or expresses suicidal ideation, we want and need to obtain support when these things are happening. We also need to take care of our own self. As parents, we can't care for our children unless our needs are met, so we must create time and space for our grief. We can't rush or avoid the process. It's also about allowing others to help. Let children go on outings and participate in activities with others, accept meals, etc. I find that we tend to not want to put other people out and say, no, don't worry about it, I'm fine, or, it's all okay. But actually think about it from the way that your friends and family want you to be able to, they want to help you. And that makes a difference for them, feeling, positive that they can make a difference for you. And perhaps they were touched by the loss and it will help them in their grief also. Develop your own healthy outlets. Recognize who is your support system and tap into that support system. Normally it's a small, very trusted support system. And do your best to exercise daily, even if that's minutes if it can't be longer, but parking further in the parking lot, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, even going for that walk. And hopefully you can do that here and there by yourself, or maybe it's a family walk with the kids if you don't have care, but to have the benefits of exercise for not only your physical but mental health. And more ways to take care of yourself: doing your best to establish and maintain daily routines, eating as healthily as possible, drinking lots of water. We know that that's important to do anytime, but when we're grieving, even more so, because we do become very dehydrated. Resting frequently, even if it's not sleeping, but just recognizing and giving your body that time. Rest and sleep helps the body to heal, and even if we're not sleeping well at night, resting is beneficial. Avoid or limit alcohol, not hiding feelings from our kids, not interpreting our pain as a problem either. Recognizing that, yes, when we lose something, let alone someone, it can be very difficult and painful. And it's not a problem to have emotion, it's actually something we need to do. Avoiding making changes. We use 1 year as a guideline. Some people feel that if they, sell the house or get rid of belongings of the loved one, you can do that before a year, but we certainly don't want you to rush into that. We don't want you to feel that that's going to take away your pain, because actually that can complicate things and cause for regret. So really consider any major changes, and that's why we use the guideline of that year to recognize, is it something that's really beneficial to me, or am I just trying to run and hide from what I need to face? And the last point says allow things to flow. Every darkness is followed by a sunrise. In other words, to know that this depth of despair is where things are right now and where you need to be, but that there is hope, and that this darkness will be followed by some light and some peace. But that will happen especially with the suggested tips in order to do that grief work. So I hope you found this beneficial. I know it's somewhat of a lengthy presentation, so thank you for your patience in listening to me, and especially when I needed to kill the uninvited friend that was here crawling all over some papers. It was a centipede, I guess, as well as sneeze through the presentation. So thanks for that and being potentially humored by that. And on a serious note, we know that grief is very difficult to endure. But as I said, if we can do that work of mourning and recognize that we are torn apart and we do have special needs, so both for children and adults, to be patient with ourselves and do what we need to in order to move forward on our grief journey. So for support and services both for adults and children, in order to access the Canadian Mental Health Association Bereavement Resource Program, you'll see the number there, 519-973-4435. So that's also the crisis line, but if you do feel you need one-on-one and or group support, to call this number and just request to do a bereavement intake. You'll also see the Regional Children's Center Crisis Service line there for those under 16 years old. And I mentioned the website, parentbooks.ca. And then furthering that, it's Grief and Loss Resources for Children. It's a very helpful list, I find, because there's extensive books mentioned, and it also gives a suggested age that these books would be most beneficial for. So whether it's, a small child or, around 6 to 8 years old, and even books for older kids. There's a couple resources listed at the bottom. They both happen to be by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. There are many authors and educators who write books. I just highlighted these by Dr. Wolfeld. Some of you may have heard him speak. He comes to Windsor approximately every 18 months. Families First, they sponsor and host that event. But he's got these couple books listed I think you'll find beneficial because they're for caregivers. Okay, so the ones listed on the parentbooks.ca website are for kids, and then these two at the bottom are for parents and caregivers. So just to conclude, grieving is as natural as crying when you're hurt, sleeping when tired, eating when hungry, or sneezing when your nose itches. It's nature's way of healing a broken heart. And the essence of finding meaning in the future is not to forget my past, as I've been told, but instead to embrace it. For it is in listening to the music of the past that I can sing in the present and dance in the future. So we don't ever forget our loved ones. We hold them in our hearts. We keep their memory alive in order to continue on our life's journey, hopefully finding renewed meaning and purpose. So thank you again for joining the Parenting Through Grief seminar. I do hope that you have found it beneficial. And my best to you, whatever your journey is, whether it's about loss for you or perhaps you're supporting someone but weren't as directly impacted. Again, thank you so much and take good care.